Hi, welcome to Beauty at Work. This is the second part of a 2-episode series discussing whether democracy is beautiful. Please check out the first episode if you haven't already. Our panelists in this session are Hélène Landemore from Yale University, Shadi Hamid, who is now at The Atlantic, and Osita Nwanevu from the New Republic. The panel was moderated by Samuel Kimbriel from Aspen Institute.
One quick question from the audience, and then we'll do a little bit of cross-conversation. Anybody want to respond to that? I think especially the thing that I found really provocative there is this idea of democracy not as an infrastructure project, that there's something else about it. Any quick reactions? Okay, so in that case, I want to pick up something maybe all three of you can talk about, and that is this question of simplicity. So part of what seems to be going on, say, in the Egyptian hymn to Pharaoh, is this idea that you can just consolidate political power in a very non-complicated way, and that there's like a luminosity here, right? And there's, in aesthetic categories, this idea of simplicity is often deferred to, including within the sciences, but in many other contexts. So when you think about democracy, are you actually kind of going the opposite direction? Maybe Shadi, you can start with this, where you want to say what's beautiful about democracy is that it's not simple, like that there's complication or conflict in the language you were using earlier?
Yeah. So I suppose another question is, what does it mean for something to be simple? I mean, I guess there's a couple different ways of looking at it. I mean, at some level, I do think democracy as a procedural system is straightforward. I think it's easy for people to grasp. You have periodic elections to choose your leaders, and there's alternation of power because people have the right to change their minds every, 4 or 5 years. Okay, straightforward, done. Authoritarianism, is that simple? I don't know. I guess the idea of having a dictator who imposes his will is simple in a way. It removes any kind of responsibility or agency from the individual. I guess that's simple. But is it straightforward? I mean, so I would say for me, the procedural system of democracy is in a sense simple, but then what democracy enables or allows is quite complicated. It's uncertain. And I think that in that sense, democracy is a bit like life or even love, that it is uncertain. You don't know what is going to happen. And that can be very frightening for people. You have to make yourself vulnerable. You have to take a risk. It's also similar, I suppose, to the afterlife. We don't know entirely for sure whether we're going to go to heaven, hell, something in between, or nothing at all. We have our intuitions. We might be 99% sure, but we can't be 100% sure, which is sort of like an election. Like, even if the polls are very clear, you're still not 100% sure.
Do you want to speak to this?
I would actually flip that on its head. I think that democracy as a procedural thing is fantastically complicated, just as on the matter of mathematics. I don't want to bore people about errors and possibility theorem and vote cycles and ranked choice voting, all of it, but it is extremely complicated. And we tell ourselves when an election is over that something very simple has happened. We tell ourselves a simple story. The people have spoken. There is a group of people called, there is the people. There was a majority, a single majority of the people that spoke. And on the basis of what everybody collectively decided in that majority together, we're going to go and do this thing. It becomes this way of simplifying society and shrinking it to the level we can sort of work with it in our own heads and tell ourselves that when government acts, it is acting in the interest of this thing called the people and majority. And so I think, I think that there's, once you kind of delve into the mechanics of democracy, there's a point where the complexity becomes unsettling because you realize that that story isn't true. And you have to sort of rebuild for yourself in a sense of what is even happening, why it's important, and why it's worthwhile.
Does that sort of fantasizing function where you win an election and then you say the American people decided such and such, does that trouble you at all?
It does.
Okay.
It does. And I think that there are better stories we could tell that would be more in line with what is actually happening on the level of statistics, mathematics, but that also would be inspiring, and that would also get people to believe democracy is still worthwhile, even if the thing about the will of the majority isn't true. I think we can recover a sense of democracy that's still spiritually enriching and important. even though the old story doesn't really hold water. But I am troubled by the extent to which we don't really interrogate in this country what it is we're actually doing when we go to the polls. We're just sort of comfortable with the fact that we run elections in such a way that most of the time, if most people who go to the polls vote against somebody and the person at the top happens to win a plurality, that person's going to get the position, the office. And the thing that most people who voted against that person don't have that, we don't think about that. We don't really internalize that. And, I think that there's a lot of mischief in ignoring that and politicians kind of adopting the language of the majority, the people, without ever really letting people into what's actually going on,
Hélène, do you want to speak maybe to both of these things that we just brought up? So to the simplicity question a little bit. And also, maybe you can even say in a little bit in your own work, are you kind of pushing to simplify it a little bit, the nature of democracy? And then maybe you can talk a little bit about these majority-minority dynamics like Osita was just.
I think I am indeed trying to return to a simpler understanding of what democracy is about. I think it's about people coming together, talking it out, and then taking a vote on the basis of one person, one vote. That's very simple. It's a simple heuristic where you don't have to figure out who's wrong or who's right. You just assume we're all roughly equal in our common sense. And then you just distribute the power equally and you tally the votes and you go with the majority. It's that simple. And it's also a lot more transparent than the Byzantine sort of systems where you have an elite that makes decisions behind closed doors. You don't know what's really going on, who really has the power. And unfortunately, because the world is complex for historical reasons of past dependence, we've ended up, for example, in the US, with a system where you have checks and balances and separation of powers, which in theory are good things, but have made things completely opaque and unreadable. So now the legislative power is distributed over Congress, but also the executive, but also federal agencies. You don't know who's accountable for what. You don't know who's really behind the decisions. And you never have a sense of how to make people accountable for anything. The military is spending billions, trillions on without accountability. It's opaque, it's untransparent, it's incomprehensible. Same thing with the tax code. Then you have armies of lobbyists and people who have an interest in keeping things as complicated as possible. For me, democracy is when people understand the law is clear, the law is sort of accessible. And I don't think we live in systems like that. And yes, I hear already the objection, well, it's because the world is complex. I don't think our system needs to be that complicated, even in the face of a complex system.
Sorry, just to sort of build off something Hélène just said. I consider myself a critic of what people call American democracy. I don't think we are a democracy, and I spent a book arguing that. But one of the things I think misleads people about the democratic character of this country is that we have so many damn elections at every level. We have a truly internationally remarkable number of elections, elected positions. We elect judges, in a way that I think people in other developed countries would find absurd. So we're always, going through the motions of democracy. We cast a lot of ballots. But I think to Helene's point, I think a lot of that just ends up making the system seem really confusing, and you don't really know who's accountable for what, and you can't keep track of everything that's going on, what elections are happening, what this position's about. Anybody who's ever voted in like a local election has experienced this, right? So there's a way in which everything that we call, or a lot of what we call democracy in this country, is actually making the system, like Hélène said, more opaque and more inaccessible and more difficult to participate meaningfully in and in an informed way in.
So just listening to this back and forth right now, I couldn't help thinking, okay, this is kind of complicated. So I actually don't really I was trying to figure out what's my opinion hearing Hélène and Osita. And I realized I don't actually have a strong opinion one way or the other to share with you. I do think though that another aspect of beauty comes to mind. And I think democracy does allow for this, which is there's a beauty in letting go. There's a beauty in not having a position. There is a beauty in not knowing the law. There is a beauty in not knowing about the candidate that's standing for your local election. Politics is important, but it should never be the most important thing. And democracy is what allows us to make a decision on our own as individuals that we simply don't care enough to develop a particular position on a particular issue. And I think we need much more of that. Certainly in American democracy, we have to empower people to look elsewhere for meaning. So that to me is a beautiful thing. It's difficult to do, especially if you're well educated. And, we're sort of conditioned to think that we have to feel moral and we have to take a moral position perpetually on everything that's going on. But I think that is a somewhat narrow view of morality. And I would also say that this brings me back to God. I think it's more possible to let go if this isn't everything. If you don't believe in God and if you don't believe in something after this, you're almost compelled to invest this life with a certain kind of meaning that is just unsustainable, untenable, and bound to collapse unto itself. But that's I think maybe a bigger debate.
Maybe let's go and I think why don't we pull in 2, 3, 4 questions and also maybe comments. So all of us are actually living in these societies and in these big democratic debates. So we've got one here and there. Let's do those 3 first and then we'll pull in some more. Do you have a second microphone maybe that you can bring here to the middle row? Yeah, please.
It's a difficult critique, really, to what the speakers are saying because we don't have much time. But I would say at the foundation of the problem, it seems to me the 3 of them agree in what I think is the crisis of democracy. That is to say, Professor Landemore, when she talks about her idea of an open democracy, this is not much different than Jürgen Habermas's idea of the theory of communicative action and democracy, right? You're familiar, right? So this is just we dialogue, we take a vote, and then we'll go with that. And that this is the foundation of democracy, which is also where the other 2 speakers seem to be advocating sort of a John Rawlsian procedural democracy. As long as the procedure is fair, then we go with that. But that is precisely the crisis of democracy. It surprises me that Professor Landemore, who is a European, doesn't seem to count on the fact that having the procedure or having the dialogue and taking the vote and going with that is also what gave us Hitler in Germany, right? Hitler was voted democratically into power. The Anschluss in Austria in 1938 was also democratically sound from the procedural point of view. So this is no assurance of justice, and this was also the fatal flaw of Jürgen Habermas's program. You have not responded how you ensure that just ends are achieved just because you have a dialogue and have consensus.
Okay,
Last
good.
point that I'll make.
Yeah.
If you can have consensus or a procedural vote on anything, which is seemingly what the 3 of you are saying, could we have a vote on let's enslave Black people again in America, and we will have a vote, and if the vote turns out favorable, we will just adopt that, and that is democracy. Good. I think this is the antithesis of democracy, when you don't have any non-negotiables and don't even understand how to reach them.
Okay, good. Yeah. So basically the question I think will be the tension between the justice as an end and whether democracy itself can give you an unjust end in that sense. That's great. Let's go ahead and take the other 2 and then we can put them. Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is just a follow-up clarification question on the last comment that Dr. Hamid made. Are you advocating for a less informed, less caring electorate and voting public because it's God's going to make it okay in the end, and we should just trust that that's the case?
Good. 2 provocative questions so far.
Mine is also for Shadi. So you were talking about we need to return to this, or we can maybe never return to this time of consensus, like under Islamic caliphates, other historic systems of government. And I guess my question is, was there real homogeneity of thought in those cultures, or was there just not representative democracy that would illuminate dissent and tensions in those cultures?
I think these questions actually go nicely together. Maybe Hélène. Yeah, please. Microphone can come to you. Just a second, Hélène. We'll take one more from the audience. Sorry, just a second.
I think your comment was very astute, because at the time of the Civil War, majority of Americans actually weren't pro-slavery. And I had leaned to my friend and said I would still be a slave under those circumstances. And so I understand the wisdom of crowds, but not always.
The procedure did not end this problem. The consensus did not end slavery in America.
Yeah, good. No, that's good. And I think this comes to, I think actually like a very significant question, which has shown up today already, which is related to the transcendence of beauty. And I think also the transcendence of ideals like justice. So in order for democracy to be beautiful, do you need some vantage point that is not simply subject to democracy? And I think that's a really clear way to kind of think of this. So Hélène, go ahead. Why don't you address this, and then we can go to you.
I want to get about minority rights and potential abuses of a majority, but then of course I agree, and in fact I'd give you what the answer that Habermas would give is that, you know, the rules are not just the rule; they contain in themselves their own conditions and limits, in a way that you've got some constraints on majoritarian power that are co-evil, as you know Habermas puts it, with the very notion of democracy. So you'd have human rights, a set of liberal rights like freedom of speech, right to vote, freedom of religion, etc. It's one that I'm just advocating for greater majorities, but I'm not talking about returning to a sort of pre-liberal age like the ancient Greece, where, you know, none of that was constitutionalized. But that's what's interesting when you go back to ancient Greece is that you find out that the democracy itself, without the liberal framework, was able to generate protections for fundamental rights that we would, I think, consider liberal, like certain provisions on freedom of speech, so that people could say what they want in the assembly, things like that. So there was an internal logic of just the democracy framework that was already providing certain things that we're used to considering, counter-majoritarian or liberal. So I think that's one aspect. I think it's important to also realize that those two things that there's a certain autonomy of the democratic framework. But of course, like the question of who's included the demos is fundamental. And before on was the question of, okay, once we have demos, how do we settle our disagreements? Consensus also, I just wanted to just make a point about what I mean by it. I don't mean unanimity and a sort of crushing, thick set of background norms. For me, consensus is a product of the deliberation, not a precondition for it necessarily. It's not something that will require everybody to agree. It's not something that's permanent, and it's a temporary sort of fixed point in a continually changing and evolving discussion. We have to reach decisions, so it's better if more of us agree than fewer, I would say. So that's what I mean by that. And then just a point about the glorification of conflict. I would say that historically, for me at least, it's a very sort of male and elitist thing to push, because conflict really means, it means divorce, it means blood and wars and death. I don't think there's anything that beautiful about it. Maybe you can say it from the outside, from a Nietzschean perspective, if you want, but from the inside, I don't see anything desirable about it. I think it's something that we strive to avoid as individuals and our politics. I'm not saying it should be all roses and harmony all the time, but it's much more livable when you try to be civil and respectful and listen to each other.
So I don't have a consensus-based view of democracy or why it's important. I think it would be terrific, actually, if we were to, vanquish conflict and difference and disagreement and deep disagreement from society. And I don't know that we can. I think that efforts to do that have actually been quite bloody and violent and redolent with all the things that we tell ourselves is bad about conflict. So my view of democracy is closer to Shadi's, where I think is a way of adjudicating and sort of explaining our differences to ourselves, and through debate and discussion and dialogue, this constant process of reforging coalitions is the way we kind of get around conflict being something that leads to bloodshed. Ideally, I think somebody said in all of my reading that I've done over the past years, the democracy is fundamentally about uncertainty and the idea that there's this constant negotiation, and it's never really settled, but you're giving people the agency that they need to have some measure of control over their lives and to sort of play that out over and over and over again in different ways, which I think is one of the things that I think we should consider on this question of minority rights and the dangers democracy may pose to people who find themselves on the wrong side of the vote. If democracy is fundamentally about, as I think it is, granting people a measure of agency and control over their lives, giving everybody the opportunity to govern in some capacity, something like slavery becomes impermissible from that standpoint. Something like sending people to the gulag or the gas chamber is impermissible because you're not treating that person as somebody with agency. You're not treating that person as somebody who has an equal rights, an equal share in governance. And so, I think that allows us to say that there should be constitutional arrangements, whether that's the Supreme Court or some other similar way of adjudicating, checking, evaluating democratic decisions. I think that's entirely can be read as consistent with democracy. I know people will shunt that off into liberalism as something that's different and above democracy, but I think that there's a way you can read democratic values where you see institutions like that. And I'm not saying the institutions we have in the United States perform it well. I don't think they do. But I think that in principle, institutions like that could be reconciled with a system of democratic values if we think about the first principles in the right way.
Shadi, a lot of your work is on this topic. So
yes, I love these questions and they go together quite well.
They're also targeting you specifically.
So the first thing I would say to the first questioner, it's precisely right. There is no guarantee of just outcomes or just ends in a democratic context. That it's not clear to me why that should be the necessary result. Democracy may be good, but good things can also lead to bad outcomes. And there's no way, at least not to my knowledge, of guaranteeing against bad outcomes. The only way to guarantee against bad outcomes is to not have democracy. It's to impose one way of looking at the world and saying that no other options will be considered. And then this goes back to the lack of moral consensus in the modern era. We don't know what just outcomes are. Or to put it differently, we can't agree as citizens on what just outcomes are. So for us to say, well, this democratic process is leading to an unjust end, you may think it's an unjust end. I may think it's a just end because my first premises, like my basic conception of the universe, is fundamentally different than that of my fellow citizens. And that is the reality that we live in today in America. Chances are, if we did a poll right now, we would not have any fundamental agreement on some pretty foundational questions. And this brings me to a couple of the other points that were made, which are, I think, really good points. And I'll just be straight up. Yes, I am in part calling for lower information. I don't actually think information or knowledge are always unqualified goods. And we should all ask ourselves, as citizens of this country or whatever country, why do we automatically assume this to be the case? And I actually wrote a piece laying out the case. If you want to read more about it, it's called "You're Better Off Not Knowing." It was in the Atlantic 2 months ago. That is the full version of the case, and I stand by it. It's not clear to me that America has gotten better with more information, more knowledge, more people following the news. And I actually call on Americans to not follow the news. And I want to ask every single person here, how does it help you to know the ins and outs of Trump's indictment or any particular issue when you go to the New York Times homepage and it's there and it's making you panic about something that you have no control over, and it actually doesn't improve your life or anyone else's life in any kind of tangible way? We should follow the news on things that maybe we have a particular interest in, or things that are relevant to our work or our activism, or we should But, honestly, beyond those cases, I would advise people to actually move away from the news and to instead think about foundational questions. And those are much better understood and acquired through things like religion, community, friendship, and so forth, not from reading the newspaper. And just the last point on whether pre-modern societies actually had consensus and were homogenous in some way. They were homogenous on foundational existential questions. So if you are, if you're a Muslim living under a caliphate, then you will not question, first of all, God's existence. Or at least there's not a critical mass of people who they might maybe privately question God's existence in moments of doubt, but no one is advocating an alternative conception of the good, an alternative to the kind of Islamic system that we saw historically. What are some of these alternatives? Liberalism. Liberalism did not exist in the pre-modern era. And part of the challenge today in the Middle East is that there are now competing conceptions of the good, competing worldviews and systemic visions that were never there previously. Secularism as we understand it today, never existed in the pre-modern period. These are modern inventions and innovations. They might be good ones, but they simply did not exist in some of these pre-modern societies and civilizations in any kind of recognizable form.
So on this question of knowing things, I think it's good for people to be curious and interested in the things that are going on in the world around them and interested in how the world works. We're at a university. I think this is a good venue for that argument. I will say that if you're choosing a publication to drop from your news diet, you might well choose The Atlantic. I don't know. If you had to choose one to get it, but I think Shadi's point, it is debilitating. Just somebody who covers the news day in and day out, it is deeply depressing and troubling. And it makes my heart hurt and it makes me scared sometimes. And I do despair for this country and the planet. But the work of living in society is hard. Shadi sounds a lot to me like Jason Brennan, actually, which is somebody I know Hélène knows well, who's made this very similar argument about tuning off and about how politics turns us into worse people and we're not necessarily benefiting from it. This is a very common argument amongst libertarian critics of democracy. And whenever I hear people say this, I do sort of think back to how novel mass participation in democracy kind of is. So in the last 150 years, we've had this surge of people swell in and participate in politics, women, African Americans, expanded access to democracy and the vote amongst the poor. And obviously people are doing their very best to roll those things back right now. But as we saw all of these people by the millions take a stand and take responsibility again for their existence in society, I don't know that the empirical record shows that America was worse off for those things having happened. I think that those people saw their own lives improve and that the country as a whole improved, got stronger, got more wealthy, got more enriched culturally, through mass participation, through people doing the difficult and often depressing work, yes, of being democratic citizens. And if we abandon that task, the people who are going to be left over to, lord it over everybody else in politics are not going to be a representative group of the public. They're going to be people who are going to use the ignorance and the ambivalence of the rest of the public to their own ends. We're going to be taken advantage of in ways that I don't think we'd be comfortable with. So as hard as it is to watch the news, and yeah, you don't need to pay attention to everything, and you don't need to, be on constant watch on CNN to see what door Donald Trump goes through in the Manhattan courthouse. Yeah, you can skip that, sure. But the actual work of, being involved and getting to know about subjects that you might not know about and that might be at some distance from you in your own life, I'm sorry, that's just how democratic society functions. And we can do it. We've done, I think, an admirable job of that work through our history and over the last 150 years especially. And I would hate to see us abandon that work now.
Just to clarify one thing, I'm not saying that people shouldn't participate. I'm saying there's different ways to participate, and they don't require having a lot of knowledge about particular issues. You should have the choice to completely ignore an entire, like very large sections of human existence if that's your preference. Ultimately, that falls back on the individual. I think it's much more useful to actually interrogate your first principles and like read religious texts in some monastery. And then, that can actually give you a lot more insight into what fundamentally matters. You don't actually need to be aware of 99% of day-to-day developments in your society in order to know what your convictions are or your first principles are. But that's ultimately a personal choice that people make. I just want people to feel empowered to make that choice, and for those people to not be judged or dismissed as somehow being bad citizens or incomplete voters or something to that effect. And I think in left-leaning elite circles, there is an obsession with being knowledgeable. And that's part of what I want to challenge and problematize, if you will.
Okay. So let me, I want to take this conversation actually back towards some sort more philosophical principles quickly before we conclude. So it seems to me like there's an ambiguity in the kind of articulation we've had so far, which is whether it's democracy that's beautiful, or is it that democracy gives space for something beautiful about human life or human beings in some other way. And maybe you would say an essential aspect of what makes humans beautiful is agency or autonomy. Under an authoritarian regime that's not able to come out, democracy actually enables that or facilitates it. And this question about the news touches on it a little bit. It's sort of people have the autonomy also to not be very participatory, like to be able to draw back a little bit or to engage if they feel like it's important to them. So that's one side of it. The other side would be to say democracy itself actually has like a beautiful characteristic to it. And I'd be maybe all three of you can comment on that now, and then we can see if there's like maybe one more question from the audience after we do.
Question to your question, Sam,
yeah.
Which is, what does it mean for democracy itself to be beautiful? Because what is the inherent content of democracy? I mean, can we really ever truly assess something or understand it outside of what it enables or empowers or produces? There's no way for us to kind of create an alternative world where all we have is the kind of perfect form and nothing else, nothing of the results or outcomes of the form. The form does not exist outside of its context.
So this is like Socrates answering a question with like a paragraph long question. So it seems like that was an answer. Osita, did you want to say anything?
I'm still hung up on what beauty is to begin with. If people have more answers on that, please, help me out with that. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that for democracy to function, again, as I kind of said in my remarks, people have to think of it as like a beautiful or sublime system. I think it would help us improve democracy if people had that much of an investment. It's I sense that it should be beautiful in some way, or that it should contribute to human flourishing in some way that we don't really assume that it can right now. If people read their, John Dewey or whatever, I think that'd be great. I do, though, feel sufficiently confident in democracy as a system and as a way of thinking about the world to believe that it ought to be expanded substantially and expanded into different domains. I'm glad you gave me the mic because I had to say this at some point, and I just needed to get the right opportunity. So we're at the Beauty at Work conference, and it was very inspiring and moving actually to read that report and see so many people say that they found beautiful things just within the course of doing their jobs as physicists or as biologists. The patterns that they noticed, all these systems that they got to take in and experience and figure out. That's wonderful. For most people, work is not beautiful. Work is not delightful. Work is a pain. It's a struggle. It's something that they barely tolerate. Some people do find a lot of joy in their jobs. I don't know that that is the majority of Americans or the majority of people in the world. As a matter of fact, I think that work has gotten worse in this country over the last half century or so. Workers now have fewer and fewer rights. Our bosses have more and more authority over us. We get less and less for the things that we do, it seems, or at least it seems that sometimes we're on a treadmill. And I think that these are all problems in some sense of agency. The economy is a realm where we do not actually have a lot of power to shape the conditions that order our lives. And I think that is a democratic problem. I think it's a problem that might admit some democratic solutions as a matter of design when we think about the structure of corporations, or even something just as basic as expanding labor rights. But I do think that work as a domain is something that ought to be democratized if we want to fully embody democracy in this country. And I think that that would actually have some, it would redound to the benefit of political democracy as well in all sorts of ways. I don't know if that counts as like a maximalist conception of democracy that Shadi would oppose. But I actually think it's not a maximalist one. I think that if you take, again, the first principles of democracy seriously, that we want it because we want to have some measure of agency over our lives and the chaos of the universe. That basic idea is something that has very radical implications if you take it to its logical conclusions, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, so roughly it sounds like the case is there is something in humanity that's beautiful, including exercising agency. Democracy, as Hélène said at the beginning, seems a bit ugly at the start until you realize what it's making possible. Hélène, is that roughly, like in terms of how humans can live, is that roughly how your case works?
I think the primacy is with individuals, right? We care about individuals rather than about systems per se. So to that extent, I think democracy is instrumental to the well-being, happiness, flourishing, freedom of individuals. So to that extent, I would say yes. What matters is that the beauty of individuals. I don't think the ugliness of the current system, however, turns into anything beautiful. I'm really disillusioned with that, and that's why I think that we have to reconnect with the idea of democracy and try to envision how it should translate institutionally. And I don't think it should translate institutionally anymore into the kind of electoral bickering, partisan politics that we're familiar with. Similarly, I completely agree with what's just being said that the next frontier for thinking about democracy is probably the workplace. I'm part of this group of women. We've launched this movement, democratizing work, and we think that to the extent that there is domination, power, and questions of justice in the workplace, the answer probably is something along the lines of a democratic system or an equalization of power or an inclusion of voice for all stakeholders. So the bigger philosophical question that I'm not sure I can answer is what's the ultimate value, right? I mean, in Plato, beauty is not the ultimate value. It's just a getaway to a higher good, which is the good, or even before that, the truth or other things, right? So what is it that we are after? And I don't think as a political theorist that I can answer that. I think that now we are entering the territory of indeed something like theology or religion. It's really difficult to answer.
Great. One more question from us, and then I'll have to give the mic back to maybe someone who hasn't. Yeah, back there at the very back.
Okay, this is awesome and been really great to listen to, so thank you. I'd like to ask specifically about the American system of government. So I think an important clarification is that we are not a democracy, we're a democratic republic. And something that I think is beautiful about the American system of government, particularly how it was created by our founders, is the balance between the three branches of government, the separation of powers, separation between the powers of the state and the federal government. I think there's a lot of balance, there's a lot of symmetry, and there's a lot of checks there. And I think that is beautiful. And I think it prevents against some of the true ugliness that pure democracy in like the simple majority type scenario that was spoken about earlier can create: mob rule, populism. And I think that, so I would just ask, is the American system of government as it was created with that federalism, those checks and balances, is that beautiful?
That's great. Thank you so much. So I'll actually just give this one to Osita. So when you think about I think this is the theme that has come up with a lot of the questions, which is, if you do want to embrace democracy, how does that not end up having a kind of tyranny to it? And I think you do have answers to that you've thought about carefully. So maybe you speak to that and tie it in with this question about America.
Yeah, on the question of the American system, once again, I'm very reluctant to make strong statements about the beautiful, generally speaking. But here, as with beauty in general, I do have my basic intuitions. And my basic intuition about the American political system is that it is terrible. The balance and this kind of sense that we have a well-tempered system, I think, is being challenged very well this particular week when we're all on tenterhooks waiting to see whether we're going to destroy the global economy as a consequence of this arcane, very stupid, and very internationally unique way of handling our debts. That's not a feature of the constitutional order as the framers created it, but it does sort of, I think, it should suggest to us that maybe it is the case that this thing of ours is a little rickier than it should be in general, that we should think about pursuing other arrangements. I would agree with you in that we are not a democracy. I don't know that I'd call us a democratic republic. I think I'd call us something like a minoritarian republic. John McCormick at U Chicago, teases out different strands of the Republican tradition, the Democratic Republican tradition, and the aristocratic Republican tradition. I think if you look at the founding and the impulses of the founders and all that they said at the convention in Philadelphia in 1787, you find generally that they are more in line with the aristocratic reading of what republicanism is and is about. If we did another conference on the founding, I could go on about this for like another hour, but we have like 30 seconds. But I think that what is beautiful to me about this moment, I will say maybe, is that it is calling into question some of the assumptions we've taken for granted about the nature of the system for a very long time. If we care about mob rule and populism and all of those scary things, it should matter to us that most Americans who went to the polls in 2016 did not choose Donald Trump as the person that they wanted to be president. Donald Trump was a product of the American constitutional order. That is why he was president. It was not because this writhing mass of antipathy and whatever actually captured most of the American people. He was there as a function of the way our political system is designed. He was sustained in office and not impeached as a function of the way our political system is designed. And I think that those things are becoming clearer and clearer to people. And I think we're at a moment of potential reinvention. That's beautiful, right? The idea that we can come together and create something new and that suits our purposes better. And the process of creation and rediscovery. I think that potentiality to me, I guess, feels beautiful. The American political system, to the extent that I have any kind of basic sense of what beauty is not beautiful to me. No.
Shadi, you're sort of often much more pro-American. Do you want to say just a few words about that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we are currently a democracy. I mean, I'm not aware of any mainstream well, there might be one or two, but the preponderance of mainstream political scientists would consider America today to be a democracy, a flawed one, perhaps. And, we can add other modifiers to it. I mean, you're right that the founders weren't small d Democrats in the way that we understand the word today. I mean, there wasn't universal suffrage, for one. And we would not consider any country today that didn't have universal suffrage to meet even a minimalistic standard of democracy. So you're certainly right about the founding, but America today is a democracy. I guess I'd say I'm not thrilled about the idea of creating something new. And it's worked out pretty well up until now. Like, for all the faults, I mean, America is the most successful nation state in history. From my perspective, and I think that I'd be more than comfortable making that case pretty explicitly. This has been an incredible experiment. It's not perfect, but it's very hard for me to look at everything up until this moment and to say that this is a failure, or this is ugly, or this is bad, or that we have to have a new founding, a refounding. Be careful what you wish for, because whatever's new, and I don't know who is going to make this new thing. And I don't know what that's going to look like. And I wouldn't want to mess too much with a formula that has been pretty positive up until now. I mean, you can't have the good without the bad. There is no, we introduce better things or good things in other areas in the US system. There are going to be profound trade-offs that we can't necessarily anticipate.
So I just want to say thank you to all three of you so much. This has been a real pleasure to be able to converse in this kind of way. I'll also say that the three of us in person spent at least a year and a half arguing about this topic behind the scenes. And you'll see that if you would like to all continue to argue over drinks, I'm sure that we'll have it resolved by the end of that conversation. But I do think the tone of like the questions and I think our interaction does indicate something about the importance of the question that Brandon set, which is there's something visceral in politics. And I think that that's on the surface for a lot of people at the moment, a way in which these questions pull out a kind of sensitivity and they have an intensity. And I think that that does relate to this idea that dropping from a register that where politics is just about the mind and sort of, like you were saying, engineering appropriate utility company for voting or whatever, into the blood and the place where it does actually happen. I think that that is actually an incredibly important question. And I'm really grateful to Brandon for setting it for us. Thank you to all of you. And I gather that we'll now get instructions for how we can go and continue to talk, but also hopefully drink, I would think.